Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce said in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. He didn't know she could hear him from the supply closet. He didn't know that the woman he was dismissing had spent 3 tours in Helmand Province keeping Marines alive with nothing but a tourniquet and muscle memory when the mortars started falling. Sarah Chen stood motionless among the 4 bags and sterile gauze, her hand steady as surgical steel, listening to a man who had no idea what was standing 15 feet away from him. 2 days. That's how long it would take for everything to change. But she didn't know that yet. She just stood there, breathing, waiting for him to leave so she could finish restocking the trauma bay before the next code came through. Sarah had arrived at Seattle General Hospital in Denver 8 months ago with a cardboard file, a nursing license that was authentic down to the dental records, and a Pentagon mandate that would end her career if anyone found out she had one at all. Captain Sarah Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment support attached, 3 deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, and a classified assignment that sat somewhere in the space between the Department of Defense and the Drug Enforcement Administration. Pharmaceutical diversion. That's what the briefing had called it. Military-grade painkillers, antibiotics, and equipment finding their way off hospital shelves and into civilian distribution networks that eventually fed into supply chains reaching overseas. Follow the pills. Find the pipeline. Report back. Don't get caught. Her locker on the 3rd floor of the nursing station contained scrubs in 3 colors, a protein bar she never ate, compression socks, and one object she checked on every single shift, a folded American flag in a clear plastic sleeve with faded creases from being pressed against her sternum beneath her shirt for 247 days. Marcus Rodriguez. Bagram, 2019. The flag had come home in her rucksack because someone had to carry it, and Marcus had been good people. The fluorescent lights hummed against white tile, a sound like electricity in her teeth, as she moved through the ER in the way she'd learned to move through chaos, economical, precise, never rushed. One hand glided across the supply shelf. The other arranged trays in the order they would be needed. Crash cart organized by frequency of use. Intubation equipment stacked from smallest pediatric tubes to adult sizes. Chest decompression needles in a separate drawer because she knew that someday, minutes would matter more than protocols, and she wanted to know exactly where to reach without looking. Her forearms were scarred in patterns that told stories, one horizontal line at the wrist from rebar at FOB Shank in 2018, a puckered circular mark on the inside of her left arm from shrapnel that had embedded itself while she was applying pressure to a Marine's leg wound. She wore long sleeves even in the summer months because questions were the enemy of cover. Nobody looked at her directly. That was the beauty of the job. The nursing station existed in layers, and nurses occupied the layer that doctors looked through rather than at. Invisible. Useful. Silent. She had cultivated perfect invisibility over 8 months, the kind of invisibility that came with impeccable work and the absence of ego. When a resident forgot to order blood work, Sarah didn't say anything. She simply completed it herself and charted it under the resident's name. When the trauma surgeon from St. Mary's rotated through and left a patient central line with inadequate dressing, Sarah didn't correct him. She simply changed the dressing with the kind of focus that implied she was following his instructions, not replacing his judgment. Humility was her uniform now, even more than the scrubs. Dr. Gregory Pierce arrived for his shift at 6:51 a.m., 9 minutes before his official start time, just early enough to establish punctuality, not early enough to be suspiciously eager. His Ivy League ring caught the fluorescent light as he set down his leather briefcase next to the nursing station computer, and Sarah noticed the way he paused, the way his eyes moved across the trauma bay she'd just finished restocking. She was standing at the medication cart, her hands occupied with checking stock levels of dopamine and epinephrine, the routine work of someone who belonged in the background. He looked at her the way a surgeon looks at a scalpel that's slightly less sharp than it should be, an instrument that still functions but not at the level he expected of himself. Who restocked Bay 3? His voice carried the particular acoustics of a man who'd spent enough time in lecture halls to know how to make every word ring with authority. The nursing station went quiet. Not the sudden silence of something shocking, but the thin silence that came when senior staff asked questions about junior staff work. Sarah didn't look up from the cart. She simply answered in the tone she'd perfected, deferential, without servility. Honest, without pride. "I did, Doctor." 8 months of this voice. 8 months of erasing the command cadence from her speech patterns, of removing the brass from her bearing, of learning how to stand in a room without taking up space. The old her, the her from Kandahar, from the 160th SAW pickup zones, from the medevac runs that came in under fire, would have moved differently, spoken differently, existed differently. That Sarah had walked into a room and people had straightened their spines. This Sarah walked into a room and people forgot she was there. Dr. Pierce reviewed her work with the expression of someone examining evidence of a crime. He didn't move anything. He didn't check the needle gauges or verify the 4 bag placements. He simply stood there, his jaw working in a way that suggested his teeth were clenched, and then he moved to the computer without a word. Whatever he'd been looking for, he hadn't found it, which meant he'd found something worse, an absence of fault that forced him to invent one. The morning moved forward in the rhythm that trauma centers know by heart. 2 motor vehicle accidents rolled in around 7:30. A pediatric aspiration case came through around 8:15. Sarah moved through it all with the kind of technical precision that came from having spent for years learning to keep people alive in the spaces between the medical books and actual human fragility. She anticipated needs before they became urgent. She positioned patients for optimal access before doctors asked for it. She had the equipment ready, not when it was needed, but 3 seconds before, in the way of someone who understood that 3 seconds was sometimes the difference between a living person and a name on a memorial wall. By 10 a.m., Dr. Pierce had made a decision about her. She could see it in the way his eyes tracked her movements now, not with indifference but with active assessment, the way a predator sizes up competition. He didn't know what he was looking at. He saw a competent nurse with unconventional technique and no confidence in her own credentials, the kind of person who probably got their license through some accelerated program, one of those career switchers who didn't have the pedigree to back up their skills. What he didn't see was a woman who had run triage on a makeshift airfield under indirect fire, who had performed emergency decompression on a collapsed lung in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter while it was taking small arms fire, who had trained enough times in enough scenarios that her muscle memory could navigate trauma protocols in her sleep. Sarah sat in the break room at 10:08 a.m. with a cup of coffee that had cooled to the temperature of abandoned hope, and she pulled out her phone. One text message from a number that didn't appear in her contacts, sent through an app that auto-deleted in 6 hours. Still clean. Continue. That was all. That was the entire conversation with her handler, Colonel Marcus Halloway, 75th Ranger Leadership, who checked in on her every 72 hours through a system so encrypted that even the NSA's back doors were locked out. The pharmaceutical diversion investigation had led her to 4 separate supply chain nodes, and she'd documented the names of 2 hospital staff members who were almost certainly involved in the diversion. 3 weeks of data collection remained before she could exfil with a complete chain of custody ready for federal prosecution. She deleted the message and turned the phone face down on the table. Dr. Pierce pushed through the break room door at 11:03 a.m., and Sarah watched him process the fact that she was sitting in his space, using his break room, occupying air that he apparently had primary claim to. His expression cycled through surprise and then something that looked like irritation. He had a Starbucks cup in his hand, not the watery hospital coffee, but something that cost $12 and came with his name spelled slightly wrong by an employee who didn't care enough to ask for clarification. He was tall, the kind of tall that came with the expectation of deference, and he moved the way people do when they've never had to make themselves smaller in any room. "You're the new hire in trauma." It wasn't a question. It was a statement constructed to sound like a question, the kind of rhetorical device used by people whose thoughts were more interesting to themselves than the answers they received. Sarah met his eyes briefly and then returned her attention to her coffee. 8 months now. She kept her voice level. Exactly level. The way you'd speak to a superior officer, not because he outranked you, but because he outranked your cover. "And you?" He paused, searching for her name in the filing system of his mind and coming up empty. It didn't bother him. Names of staff below his level were retrievable information, not essential knowledge. You're doing a lot of the heavy work. Restocking. Supply management. That's good. That's necessary. He said it in the tone of voice someone uses when they're complimenting a tool for being functional. Then he left, and the break room was quiet again except for the sound of the refrigerator's compressor and the distant ping of the intercom announcing a new admission to radiology. Sarah sat alone and drank her cold coffee and didn't think about the flag in her locker, because thinking about Marcus during work hours was a luxury that could compromise her focus. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago, in a desert where the thermometer hit 127 degrees and the medevac bird couldn't arrive for another 37 minutes. You compartmentalized. You functioned. You stayed useful. She returned to the ER at 11:11 a.m., and by noon, the day had settled into the particular rhythm of controlled chaos that trauma centers maintain during daylight hours, serious enough to require constant attention, not catastrophic enough to trigger the full mobilization of every available resource. Dr. Pierce moved through the unit with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in any hierarchy, and more than once, she felt the weight of his attention, the particular focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that was bothering him. She was too competent. That was the real problem, though he wouldn't have articulated it that way. She performed her duties with a kind of mechanical precision that suggested training he couldn't identify in her file. She anticipated emergencies in ways that seemed prescient. She moved through the hospital with the kind of efficiency that made his own routine seem wasteful by comparison. And all of it was delivered with such perfect deference, such absolute lack of ego, that he couldn't quite catch her in the act of being impressive. By the time her shift ended at 7 p.m., Dr. Pierce had begun to construct a narrative. She was probably trained at a military facility. Private nursing corps. The kind of place that had more discipline than the civilian system. And that discipline, that precision, it was starting to look like a threat, the kind of quiet competence that could make a director of emergency medicine look less essential than he needed to feel. He would watch her more carefully now. He would look for the cracks in her technique, the moment when her precision would slip and reveal itself as arrogance instead of training. He would never find the crack, because there wasn't one. But the looking, the deliberate, focused attention of a man whose ego had been poked by the existence of someone better at his job than he was, had already begun to poison the water. Grand rounds was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday, which meant 23 residents would gather in the conference room with their tablets and their egos, their Ivy League credentials hanging invisible around their necks like the only currency that mattered. Dr. Pierce had already selected his case, a tension pneumothorax that Sarah had charted 3 weeks ago, a straightforward decompression that she documented with the kind of clinical precision that made the patient walk out of Seattle General breathing normally, walking, alive. He pulled up her notes on the projector as the residents settled into their seats, their attention tilting toward the screen like plants turning toward light. Sarah stood at the back of the room, her hands folded in front of her, her scrubs the same shade of surgical green as everyone else's, which meant she disappeared into the background if you weren't looking for her. But Dr. Pierce was looking. "Notice Nurse Chen's documentation here," he said, circling her handwriting with a red laser pointer, the beam tracing her words like he was marking evidence at a crime scene. His voice carried the particular tone of a man explaining something shameful to people he trusted. Creative. Unconventional. Almost like she learned medicine from a television show rather than, actual training. The residents made small sounds, not quite laughter yet, but the precursor to it, the preliminary exhale before comedy settles in. He pressed the pointer against the projector screen hard enough that the red dot trembled slightly. This is what happens when we lower standards. When we let anyone with a weekend certification play healthcare provider. The laughter came then, not loud, not cruel, just the comfortable chuckle of people secure in their hierarchies, people who believed the order of things was natural and right. Sarah's jaw muscles tightened. 1, 2, 3. She counted her breaths like she was calibrating surgical instruments. Her hands remained folded. Her eyes remained fixed on a point just above Dr. Pierce's head, not looking at him, not looking away, simply existing in a state of perfect professional neutrality while he dismantled her work in front of the people she would have to work alongside for another 5 months. The tremor that wanted to start in her hands didn't. The heat that wanted to rise into her face stayed in her chest where she could control it. In Kandahar province, she'd sat across from Taliban fighters negotiating the release of a 12-year-old boy without flinching. She could survive this. She was surviving this. Each small moment of humiliation was data. It meant he was watching, which meant he hadn't yet figured out who she was, which meant the mission remained intact. By the time grand rounds ended, 3 residents had approached her separately, their voices careful, almost apologetic, saying things like, "Your documentation was actually solid and don't let him get to you." She thanked them without inflection and returned to the 3rd floor, where the vending machines hummed their electric song in the hallway outside the staff break room. She was looking for coffee, not because she wanted it, but because she needed 5 minutes away from the open floor, 5 minutes where her composure could rest even a fraction. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly blue-white that made everyone look slightly dead, which was probably intentional. Hospital architecture was designed to remind you that you were in a place where people went to escape dying. She didn't hear Dr. Pierce approach. That was the first mistake, not hearing him, which meant she'd dropped her peripheral awareness, which meant grand rounds had actually gotten under her skin more than she'd realized. He emerged from around the corner like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, which he probably had. His white coat was perfectly pressed. His stethoscope draped his neck with the symmetry of a man who cared about how things looked. "Where'd you really get that license, Chen?" His voice was conversational, the way you might ask someone where they got their lunch. "Online? Some strip mall nursing school? You perform procedures like you're guessing, like you bought the answers off Craigslist." He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of leather and desperation, the kind of fragrance a man wore when he was afraid of becoming invisible. Sarah turned. Looked at him directly. Her eyes were the color of polished steel, the kind of gaze that made most people look away first because it contained no apology, no deference, no soft edges to rest their eyes on. The silence stretched between them like a taut cable. 1 second. 2 seconds. He shifted his weight. His fingers flexed against his coat pocket. He was waiting for her to break, to defend herself, to engage with his accusations the way a normal person would. To give him something to work with. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice was a scalpel, sharp, precise, designed to make one clean cut and nothing more. "You might want to get that checked." She turned back to the vending machine, inserted her dollar bill into the slot with mechanical efficiency, and pressed the button for black coffee. The machine made its grinding sound, a noise like something mechanical dying slowly in the dark. She retrieved her cup without looking at him again. She walked away with parade ground precision, her back straight, her pace measured, her shoulders set at exactly 90 degrees. Behind her, Dr. Pierce stood motionless for 8 seconds before he turned and walked in the opposite direction, and later, one of the other nurses who'd witnessed the exchange from 30 feet away would describe it as like watching someone get cut in a way they wouldn't feel until 3 days later. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later that afternoon. Sarah was restocking the crash cart on the 2nd floor, checking epinephrine vials, verifying that the defibrillator pads hadn't expired, running her hands along the organized rows of equipment that meant the difference between organized chaos and just chaos. The cart was her responsibility, which meant she treated it the way a sniper treats a rifle, accounted for, maintained, ready. Dr. Pierce arrived with 2 security guards flanking him like he was escorting a prisoner. The guards wore their uniforms with the particular slouch of men who'd never been in actual danger, who understood authority as a matter of paperwork rather than survival. "Continue your insubordination, and these gentlemen will escort you out," Dr. Pierce said. His voice had changed, it was harder now, crystallized by something that looked like confidence but was actually just the particular rage of a man who'd been dismissed. "I've documented everything. One more word of disrespect. One more cowboy procedure. One more suggestion that you know something I don't. And you're gone." He called her nurse participation trophies within earshot of 3 other staff members who suddenly became very interested in the computers at their stations, who typed faster and looked at their screens more intently, the universal behavior of people witnessing something they wanted no part of. The guards didn't speak. They just stood there in their dark uniforms, their presence like a visual threat, a reminder that the hospital had teeth if she decided to use them. Sarah continued restocking the crash cart. Her hands moved with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, checking, verifying, replacing. When she looked up, Dr. Pierce had already turned to leave, the guards flanking him like it was a procession. She watched him go without expression, and then she was alone with the crash cart and the sound of her own breathing, which remained steady, regulated, controlled. What she didn't know was that Dr. Pierce was already making phone calls. What she didn't know was that her charge nurse, Maria Rodriguez, the woman who'd publicly praised her performance during last month's septic shock code, the woman who'd stood beside her through 2 18-hour shifts without complaint, was about to be reassigned to the pediatric wing on the opposite schedule. What she didn't know was that her name was already being whispered in the break room, that Pierce had carefully seeded concerns about questionable background and possibly falsified credentials the way a farmer plants seeds in poisoned soil, knowing exactly what would grow. What she didn't know was that her pharmaceutical dispensary access would be downgraded by morning, requiring physician co-signature for every medication, turning every routine task into bureaucratic friction designed to create a paper trail of protocol violations. The mission remained intact. Her cover remained intact. But the walls around her were beginning to close with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly how much pressure it took to crush something, how long it took, at what point the crushing became inevitable. She sat alone in the break room that evening, a turkey sandwich in front of her, a cup of coffee growing cold beside it, and thought about Marcus, about the way his hands shook the morning he left for his last deployment, about the way they never stopped shaking. She wondered if 8 years of service, if all of this, if sitting in a hospital break room while a petty man orchestrated her professional execution was actually worth it. She wondered if the mission would survive her. She wondered if she would. But she finished the sandwich. She drank the coffee. She went back to work. She didn't flinch when the ambulance bay doors burst open. The stretcher came through fast, paramedics calling vitals in the clipped rhythm of controlled panic. Pneumothorax. Tension. O2 sat 68 and dropping. The Marine commander's breathing was all wrong, rapid, shallow, desperate. His trachea deviated hard right. The classic presentation. The kill presentation. Sarah was 3 feet away, organizing trauma trays in the triage zone when she heard it. That specific wheeze. That particular sound of a lung collapsing inward like a fist closing around a heart. She'd heard it before. Not in a hospital. Under fire at Bagram airfield, 2014, in the middle of a Taliban ambush when a ranger took shrapnel through the anterior chest wall and his breath came in gasps that sounded exactly like this. She moved without thinking. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. Muscle memory just moved. Dr. Pierce was 30 seconds behind, already barking orders from the hallway, his voice the kind of loud that filled rooms but never filled them with confidence. Get him prepped for chest tube insertion, get me a kit from cardiothoracic, move, move. His words were dominoes falling, each one landing on top of the other with the weight of someone who'd never actually performed an emergency procedure under fire, only under fluorescent lights and perfect conditions. The commander was wheeled into Trauma Bay 2. Sarah was already there, hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this 50 times. 50 times in the field. 50 times when hesitation meant death. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, was excellent on rounds, competent in standard presentations, but this wasn't standard. This was urgent. This was 8 minutes before cardiac arrest. I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle, Sarah said quietly. Not a request. The statement landed and the resident across the trauma bed, a 4th-year named Kevin, moved instantly to the supply cart. Dr. Chen, Pierce's voice cracked through the bay entrance like a whip. Step back. You are not authorized to perform invasive procedures without physician direction. Sarah didn't acknowledge him. Her hands were already prepping the site. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The needle angle coming in at perpendicular entry, her left hand stabilizing the commander's ribs with the kind of care that looks gentle until you understand it's absolute. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that surgical white, everything clean and sharp and sterile. The combat medic who'd ridden with the ambulance, call sign stitched on his uniform read Graves, stepped to the opposite side of the trauma bay. He was a Marine, maybe late 20s, with the kind of alert presence that comes from having kept people alive in places where the hospital was a canvas tent and the anesthesia was whatever morphine you had in your ruck. His eyes locked onto Sarah's hands. She felt the give of the skin, the slight resistance of the fascia, then the hollow needle sliding through the parietal pleura. And then the hiss. The distinctive, unmistakable hiss of pressurized air escaping from a collapsed lung. It was a sound like relief. Like survival. Like the exact moment the needle hits the target and suddenly the mathematics of death stopped being inevitable. The commander's oxygen saturation jumped on the monitor. 78, 82, 88, 94. Climbing like a man gasping for air suddenly finding air in front of him. Tape it, Sarah said, not even looking at Morrison. Kevin moved instantly with gauze and surgical tape, securing the catheter with the kind of efficiency that only happens when everyone in the room knows they're watching a save happen in real time. The commander's breathing changed. Deeper. Slower. The frantic gasping of a man drowning in his own pneumothorax transforming into something almost peaceful. Graves was staring at her hand. Not at her face. At her hand. At the angle of needle entry. At the speed of her confirmation check. At the way she positioned her fingers with a kind of practiced geometry that only comes from having performed the same procedure in the dark, under fire, with rounds coming down around you and nothing between you and death but muscle memory and training that burns deeper than conscious thought. His whisper was barely audible. Almost to himself. That's a Bagram needle decompression. I've only seen one person do it that fast. The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor's steady rhythm. 82 beats per minute. Normal. Beautiful. Alive. Sarah's left hand trembled. Just for a moment. Just enough that anyone looking would see it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 8 years of military training colliding with 8 months of invisibility, and the collision site was her fingertips where the needle had gone in and the muscle memory had taken over and the classified part of her had stepped into the light for exactly 7 seconds before the tactical part of her brain slammed it back into the dark. She took a breath. Steadied her hand. Checked the catheter placement one more time with the calm of someone who'd already survived the worst and knew that panic was the second thing that killed you. The first thing was hesitation. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of old liver. His jaw was working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite form. Chen. You performed a procedure. Without direct physician authorization. That's a protocol violation. That's scope of practice violation. That's saving a life, Kevin said quietly. The resident. The young attending who was supposed to be watching from the sidelines had just stepped directly into the line of fire. Pierce's eyes snapped to him with the velocity of a weapon being aimed. You're on thin ice, Kevin. Very thin ice. Morrison stepped forward, studying the commander's vitals, watching the oxygen saturation hold at 94. Watching the chest rise and fall with normal amplitude. Watching a man who'd been 6 minutes away from arrest now breathing like someone who'd just been given his life back. He looked at Sarah, and something shifted in his face that looked like recognition, like the moment a doctor realizes they're standing next to someone who actually trained for emergencies instead of just reading about them in textbooks. Good work, Morrison said simply. Pierce's voice rose. This is insubordination. This is a direct violation of hospital protocol. You don't get to. But Sarah was already washing her hands. The soap smelled like industrial citrus and aluminum. The water ran warm over her wrists, and she watched the antiseptic foam disappear down the drain and thought about how it all had to disappear. The muscle memory. The Bagram training. The hands that remembered 50 procedures in the field. All of it had to disappear back into the person who was just a nurse working night shifts at Seattle General in Denver. Graves was still staring at her. Still standing on the opposite side of the trauma bay like a man who'd just heard his own language spoken by someone who shouldn't speak it. Sarah met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away. The commander's breathing was steady now. The trachea was already shifting back to midline. Within the hour, he'd be stable enough for a formal chest tube if they decided they needed one. Probably wouldn't. The needle decompression had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had bought him his life back. It had bought him tomorrow. And in doing that, it had destroyed everything Sarah had worked for. She dried her hands on a paper towel, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the waste bin across the trauma bay. 3 seconds after saving a Marine commander's life, she was back to the calculus of invisibility. Back to the weight of a mission that now had a fracture running through it. Pierce was already on his phone in the corner of the hallway, his voice low and urgent, calling someone who could turn what had just happened into ammunition. Sarah walked past him toward the medication cart. He was already planning. Already building a case. Already weaponizing the fact that she performed a procedure that had saved a life, because in the language of hospital politics, heroism was only acceptable when it came with the right credentials and the right doctor's name attached to the outcome. The commander would live. That part had been written the moment the needle went in and the air came out and the oxygen saturation started climbing toward normal. But something else had died in that trauma bay. Something that had been dying for 8 months was now officially gone. And the next 2 days would prove exactly how gone. Dr. Pierce's hands moved with surgical precision, which meant they moved with barely concealed rage. He pulled the Marine commander's chart from the rack at 14:08, exactly 42 minutes after Sarah had walked away from the resuscitation bay with her gloved hand still steady and the patient's oxygen saturation climbing toward normal. The chart felt light in his grip. Too light. But the documentation inside was heavy enough to bury her. Needle decompression. 14 mm angiocath. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. No physician order written beforehand. No verbal authorization documented in real time. Technically, and Dr. Pierce understood the law well enough to know this mattered, Sarah had performed an invasive procedure without direct physician supervision. Legally defensible? Absolutely, given the patient was hypoxic and collapsing. But legally damaging? That depended entirely on who told the story first. And Dr. Pierce was about to tell it very loudly. He walked to his office. Closed the door. His voice when he dialed the first number was calm as a tank idling in a garage, all suppressed power, all controlled menace. Janet, it's Pierce. Seattle General Board, Line 3 meeting tomorrow. We need to discuss a liability exposure in emergency nursing. No, it's recent. Yes, very recent. He hung up. Didn't wait for questions. Questions were for people without predetermined answers. The second call took 30 seconds. The third took 45. Each conversation dropped the same phrases like bait into still water, liability concerns. Credential questions. Pattern of insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. A nurse operating outside her scope, protected only by the accident that her decision happened to have worked out. This time. What about next time? What about the precedent she sets? By 15:30, 3 board members had each called the nursing director. The machinery was in motion. Pierce moved on the staffing next. Sarah's primary ally on the evening shift was Margaret, a charge nurse with 18 years at Seattle General and a memory for every nurse Pierce had ever humiliated. Margaret had defended Sarah once at a staff meeting. That was one time too many. A single call to HR, Margaret's name appeared on a reassignment list to the pediatric ward, effective immediately. No explanation. No negotiation. Margaret was good, too good, and she could wait out the politics better than anyone on the floor. So she got moved. The 3 other nurses who rotated with Sarah? One was pulled for a special administrative project. One shift got swapped to nights. One received a professional development opportunity that required her to work in a different department for 6 weeks. They didn't know why. Nurses never knew why, not really. They just knew the schedule changed and suddenly they weren't there to back up the woman who'd saved a patient with a textbook-perfect procedure that made them all look like students watching a master class. Then Pierce did the thing that would have seemed strategic if it wasn't actually brilliant. He walked to the records office and requested Sarah's access card be flagged. Patient files required authentication now. It wasn't a full restriction, that would leave evidence, would create documentation, but it was enough. Every time Sarah tried to pull a chart, there would be a delay. A question. A conversation with records. Isolation wrapped in procedure. The kind of slow-building frustration that didn't leave fingerprints. Sarah understood what was happening by 16:15. She didn't watch Pierce move through the hospital with the same competence he used in a surgical suite, but she felt it the way a captain feels incoming weather, pressure changes, wind shifts, the warning tightness in bone-deep places that still remembered Bagram. She stood in the medication room at 16:20, holding an empty tray, thinking about 8 months of paperwork that called her a registered nurse when it actually meant she was Captain Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps, embedded in civilian infrastructure to investigate pharmaceutical diversion that might reach military supply chains. The mission had a deadline. November 4th, exactly 6 weeks away. She'd been close to the final piece, a shipment protocol discrepancy that traced to a contract manager in supply, who traced to a distributor in Phoenix, who traced to a cartel network that supplied field hospitals in 3 states with diluted antibiotics and compromised blood products. If she defended herself now, if she said what she'd actually learned in 3 tours at Bagram, if she mentioned the Pentagon clearance buried in her file, the mission died. 6 weeks of remaining investigation time would evaporate. The pharmaceutical diversion pipeline would shift, rebrand, relocate. The soldiers who depended on supply chain integrity would keep depending on it while it stayed compromised. She put the tray down. Her hands were steady. The trembling, if it came at all, would wait until after dark. Pierce summoned her at 17:43. The nursing station. The entire evening shift watching. Security standing by like props in a play about institutional power, 2 officers in uniform, faces carefully neutral, trained to respond to agitation without understanding the actual conflict. The HR director, Claire Mendez, held a folder. Her expression suggested she'd been given talking points and believed none of them. Sarah. Not her usual name here. They used her first name when they decided something about you. We need to talk about your employment status. Pierce stood beside the nursing station with his arms crossed, that expression of controlled satisfaction that men wore when they'd finally gotten permission to destroy someone who'd embarrassed them. Effective immediately, he said, and he was almost smiling, for gross violations of clinical protocol, unauthorized procedures, and insubordination. Your employment with Seattle General is terminated. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. The word settled into the ER like sediment. No one moved. The monitors beeped their indifferent rhythm. A ventilator wheezed somewhere in Trauma 3. Sarah looked at him. Actually looked. Let him see that she'd understood the calculation, the setup, the beautiful strategic timing of it all. Let him see that she wasn't going to defend herself with the one truth that would have stopped him cold. I understand, she said. 7 words. Steady. Then she reached for her badge, the credential that said RN, Sarah Chen, Seattle General Hospital, and placed it on the desk beside her access card. Both of them, right there, proof that she'd stopped being anyone who mattered in this building. The laminated plastic caught the fluorescent light and reflected it back at nothing in particular. Don't forget this. Margaret was suddenly there, impossible. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago, she shouldn't have been there at all, pressing a small object into Sarah's hand. It was wrapped in plastic from the break room. Inside, a cracked coffee mug with a faded Marine Corps emblem, the kind of thing no one would notice. The kind of thing Margaret had somehow known Sarah needed. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second and then Margaret was gone, disappeared into the hallway before security could ask questions. Sarah walked out through the bay doors. The rain had started again, the kind of rain that fell like applause, relentless and indifferent. She found a bus stop 2 blocks away with a shelter that didn't work very well and sat on the bench, watching the cardboard box settle onto her lap. Inside it now, the mug from Margaret. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, Maria from Dietary had given her 3 months ago. And the folded flag. The folded flag was small but dense, the way military traditions made small things heavy. It had arrived at the hospital 2 years before Sarah did, given to a nurse named Marcus's wife at Ullington Cemetery. Sarah had found it in the employee break room, lost and found, no name attached, and she'd kept it because she understood what it meant, a life that had been lived and then measured and then folded, like a letter no one would ever read. The rain soaked through her jacket. Her phone had 6 missed calls from a Pentagon number she couldn't answer anywhere people were listening. She thought about 8 years of active service, 3 deployments, certifications in emergency medicine that the Army had paid $40,000 to obtain, a Navy Cross decorated for valor under fire that she'd never worn in public because the public didn't know she existed. This is how it ends, she thought. Not with brass bands or congressional testimony or someone finally understanding. This is how it ends, sitting on a bus stop bench in Denver, holding the flag from a dead man, watching rain fall on concrete that didn't care who was standing in it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the pharmaceutical diversion pipeline was still moving, still compromising military supply integrity, still 6 weeks away from exposure, and now there was no one inside Seattle General to document it. The investigation would have to start over. Months of Pentagon resources, wasted. Soldiers somewhere, depending on clean supply chains, would have to keep depending on compromised ones. And Dr. Pierce would go back to grand rounds tomorrow, confident that he'd removed the competence that made him look small by comparison, never knowing that the person he'd just destroyed had saved lives he'd never understand and would save more after this rain dried off her jacket. She didn't cry. Officers didn't. Not at bus stops. Not in the rain, not while holding evidence that mercy was heavier than justice. 2 days. That's how long the hospital system took to flag her file. The routine background check closure triggered at 3:51 a.m. on a Tuesday, automated protocols running their midnight sweeps through personnel databases. Sarah Chen's nursing record, complete with her civilian social security number, her forged references from fictional hospitals, her carefully constructed 8-month employment history, should have closed clean. Should have dissolved into archived files and deleted digital ghosts. Instead, the system encountered a barrier it couldn't process. A classified security clearance level that required Pentagon authorization to even view. The kind of clearance that doesn't exist in civilian nursing. The kind that makes automated systems stop and scream silently to every government agency with a listening ear. By 4:15 a.m., Department of Defense alerts had flagged the file. By 5:19 a.m., encrypted emails were routing to Pentagon personnel offices. By morning, the question wasn't whether Sarah's cover would be blown. It was when, and how publicly. Sarah didn't know any of this yet. She'd spent the last 48 hours moving through the hours like a ghost haunting a place she no longer belonged to. Her apartment was a studio on Morrison Street, cheap rent, minimal furniture, the kind of place a ghost might live if ghosts needed addresses. The cardboard box from her termination sat on a plastic milk crate. Cracked mug. Dying succulent. Folded flag. She hadn't opened the box again. Hadn't needed to. She could see it without looking, the way Marcus's flag caught the light, the precise military fold that meant someone had honored his death even as the world moved on without knowing his name. She'd scheduled her final paycheck pickup for 9 a.m. Bureaucratic timing. Hospitals ran on schedules. Final checks arrived in the accounting office at precisely 8:51 a.m. every Friday, and Sarah had learned long ago that precision was the only power left to her. She'd take her money. She'd walk away clean. She'd report the mission failure to her handler and request reassignment to something that didn't require her to swallow humiliation like medicine. The Seattle General lobby at 9:04 a.m. was exactly what she expected. Fluorescent light. Antiseptic smell cutting through the faint sweetness of flowers from the gift shop. A Saturday morning pace, slower, quieter, the real emergencies handled by second-shift crews now. She walked to the accounting window with the same posture she'd maintained for 8 months. Head down. Shoulders curved inward. The invisible nurse, the one nobody noticed, the one who took orders and asked no questions. And then the Marine commander stood up from a lobby chair. She almost didn't recognize him. Out of the ER gown, out of crisis, standing in service alphas with the fabric perfectly pressed and his medals arranged with military precision. His chest bore the insignia of a 2-star command, not just a commander, something higher, something that meant his presence here was operational. Not a coincidence. Not a recovery check-in. Military infrastructure, moving into position. When his eyes found hers, he didn't smile. Military protocol. He simply waited until she was close enough to hear him. Then he leaned in, and he whispered a single word. Not her name. Not her rank. Something older. Something earned. Phantom. The lobby tilted slightly. Her body didn't react, training held, but the internal collapse was sudden and complete. Her call sign. Her Bagram call sign. The one she'd worn in the mountain valleys where medevac helicopters couldn't land fast enough and you had to make decisions about who survived and who didn't while your hand stayed steady and your voice stayed level and the weight of those choices settled into your bones like scar tissue. He knew. The Navy knew. The Pentagon had seen her file. The Marine colonel appeared before she could process the implications. He was older, maybe 55, with the kind of face that had seen multiple deployments and made peace with the cost. His uniform was dress blues, formal wear, ceremonial wear. He stepped forward with a folder, and Sarah recognized the format immediately. Official documentation. Public record. The kind of paperwork the military released when they were about to move something from classified to broadcast. Captain Sarah Chen. His voice carried through the lobby like a general order. Not shouting. Projection. Command presence. Every person within 20 feet heard it, and every phone in the vicinity suddenly became a recording device. Navy Cross recipient for Valor under fire. Combat medic, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Bagram Airfield, Loga Province. Operation Blackstone, August 2019. He was reading her citation. Her actual citation. The one that had been sealed in a classified folder marked not for public release. He read each paragraph with measured precision, and Sarah felt the years collapse backward. 12 years of service. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. And the Navy Cross, the medal that meant you'd stood in a place where death was the most probable outcome and you'd chosen differently anyway. The general stepped forward. 2 stars on his shoulder. Dress blues perfectly tailored. His hands moved in a motion Sarah had seen only in formal settings, the military salute, a fist pressed hard against the center of his chest, the gesture that meant respect. That meant honor. That meant you were standing in front of something that required acknowledgement. Captain Chen has been operating under my direct orders for 8 months, he announced, loudly enough to ensure the lobby acoustics caught every word. Loud enough for the recording phones. Loud enough for it to be undeniable. She has served this nation with distinction. She has sacrificed privacy, career, and personal safety to protect classified investigations. On behalf of the Department of Defense, I apologize for any breach of security that compromised her position. The security guard near the main entrance stopped moving. A nurse in the corridor froze mid-step. In the gift shop, a teenager filming the scene had shifted angles to catch the general's face full-on. In accounting, someone was absolutely calling administration. Then the Pentagon liaison stepped forward. She was younger, 30s maybe, with the efficient bearing of someone who'd spent her career managing classified information and the small apocalypses that followed its revelation. Captain Sarah Chen, she said, and her voice was flat and professional and absolutely devastating. Codename Phantom. Security clearance level TSSCI with compartmentalized access to Operation Blackstone pharmaceutical diversion investigation. Authorization Pentagon level. Approval Joint Special Operations Command. She said it all loud enough to be recorded. She said it like she was announcing it to the world, because she was. By 9:17 a.m., 17 separate video recordings had begun uploading. By 9:45 a.m., they were being shared across hospital staff group chats. By 10:33 a.m., the first clip had been edited and posted to Reddit, and the algorithm had begun its relentless work of amplification. For hours later, the video had 47,000 views. By evening, 400,000. Dr. Pierce was sitting in his office when he watched it. His door was closed. His computer monitor was angled away from the window. He was alone, which was why nobody saw the color drain from his face or heard the soft, repeated sound of his breathing as if he'd just been punched. He watched himself on camera, his back to the lens, his mouth open in shock, his hand frozen mid-gesture. He watched the general salute. He watched his own patient walk across the lobby in full military dress, the invisible woman suddenly visible, suddenly more real than anything in the hospital. The phone started ringing at 5:33 p.m. Board members calling. His lawyer calling. His wife calling from her sister's house, where she'd been since Tuesday, where she apparently planned to stay. Hospital PR called to inform him that Seattle General was issuing a statement supporting Captain Chen's service and promising a review of personnel decisions. A review. That word meant everything. By 8 p.m., his Ivy League mentor had posted a statement. Dr. William Ashford, the legendary thoracic surgeon who'd published in the New England Journal of Medicine, who'd trained a generation of physicians, who'd once looked at a young Pierce and said, "You're going to be the future of cardiovascular medicine," had posted a statement that said, "I am horrified and ashamed to learn of Dr. Pierce's unconscionable treatment of a decorated military officer. His behavior represents everything wrong with modern medical education. Credentialism over competence. Ego over ethics. I formally call for his removal and apologize to Captain Chen and the Marine Corps." The post had been shared 23,000 times. Tagged. Retweeted. Forwarded in group chats across every major medical institution in the country. By the time the hospital board held their emergency meeting at 10 p.m. Friday night, Dr. Pierce's resignation was already being discussed as a formality. The only question was whether they'd accept it quietly or force him out publicly. He chose quietly. He submitted his resignation at 11:13 p.m., effective immediately. No references. No severance beyond contractual mandated minimums. By Saturday morning, the position of ER director at Seattle General was open, and Dr. Pierce's name had begun its migration into medical infamy. Sarah didn't watch any of it. She couldn't. The moment the general had saluted her, her phone had buzzed with an encrypted message from her handler, "Report to Pentagon immediately. Mission status change." The navy dress blues that had been hidden in a sealed bag in the back of her closet were now the only uniform that mattered. She stood in a Pentagon briefing room on Monday morning, service medals on her chest, the ones she'd never worn in public, the ones that had lived in sealed documentation, the ones that meant she'd been in places where the casualty rate was measured in percentages and the decisions made in 30 seconds had consequences that lasted lifetimes. A Marine lieutenant handed her a new file. "Another placement," he said simply. Seattle General bought them time. But the pharmaceutical diversion network is bigger. It reaches 3 active theaters. Field hospitals. Supply chains. We need someone on the inside again. Sarah took the folder. Her left hand was steady. No tremor. 12 years of carrying weight had taught her that trembling was a luxury. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said quietly, and she opened the file. The words on the first page blurred momentarily as another image crowded in, Marcus's flag, folded now in the shadow box on her office wall. And behind that, an echo, Dr. Pierce teaching CPR to disinterested community college students for minimum wage while his Ivy League ring had been pawned to cover mortgage payments. Justice was a thing Sarah had learned to measure in inches. In this case, she'd take it. If you're watching this, you know the truth changes everything. If someone in your life is being underestimated, being dismissed, being treated like they're less than they actually are, look closer. The quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest weight. Subscribe, because we're telling these stories, the ones that matter, the ones about people who sacrifice everything and ask for nothing in return. And comment, have you ever been completely wrong about someone? Have you ever had to apologize after finding out who they really were?